Hello everyone. Let's try to understand Promise.any in this video. Promise.any static method takes an iterable of promises as input and returns a single promise. This returned promise fulfills when any of the inputs promises fulfills with this first fulfillment value. It rejects when all of the inputs promises reject with an aggregate error containing an array of rejected reasons. So this is very similar to promise.raise where we take a list of promises and here it looks for the first fulfilled promise. And whereas in promise.raise, it checks for the first settled promise. It didn't care about the final status of the promise. Here we are looking only for the promise, first fulfilled promise. And what happens if all of the promises that we pass in rejected state? Then promise.any will return a promise which will eventually be in the rejected state. So let's check this example here. We have three promise instances here. This first one immediately rejects, and second one resolve after 100 milliseconds, and the third one resolve after 500 milliseconds. So out of the three, the first promise immediately rejects, and the second one resolves after 100 milliseconds. So that's the first promise that fulfills out of these three. So promise.any, we are passing this array of promises, which is an iterable, and we are calling the then method, and we are passing the onFulfilled callback here. So here the value should be quick because out of these two fulfilled promise, this one fulfills first. Okay. Now what happens if you pass an empty array? So if you pass an empty array, the same case when all the promises are rejected, it will reject with an aggregate error, and at that time, the errors field of that aggregate error will be an empty array. Whereas when we have a couple of promises passing in the list, and if all of them are rejected, then the promise will reject with an aggregate error, and the errors field will have an array of rejected reasons of all of that promises. So let's test this example. You can just copy it here and try here. So you can see that quick is printed. Now let's modify this example a little bit. So here I'm changing the second promise from resolve to reject. I'm using the reject function here. So now the first promise immediately rejects, the second promise rejects after 100 milliseconds, and the third promise resolves after 500 milliseconds. So the last one is the slowest one, but that's the only one fulfills. So let's check the result here. So we are passing the promises and we are passing the unfulfilled value, callback here. So after 500 milliseconds, we get that this slow string here. Okay, now let's change this also to reject. Okay, now all of the promises eventually will be in the rejected state. Now, so all promises were rejected. So we were not passing the on rejected or catch method. That's why this is uncaught. Let's try it again. So all three promises are in the rejected state, and we can attach a catch method here, and we can just pass. Okay, let's try to access the error object. In this case, all three promises are in the rejected state. Now, eventually, it will return an aggregate error. So we can try to print the message field, and also can try to access the errors field. Okay. Yeah, you can see that the message is all promises were rejected, and the errors field gives us this error, and you have this first error at the first index, and quick in the second index, and slow in the third index. The second index, 0, 1, 2. Yeah. So this is how promise.any works. Let's just try the case of empty array as well. So promise.any, we are passing an empty array, catch. So here also the same message, all promises were rejected, and the errors field is an empty array. Okay. Now we can try to build the promise.any static method without implementation. We have this myPromise class, and Okay, so any static function takes a list of promises, which is an iterable, and it returns a new promise. So here the promises object has to be an iterable. Okay, and when all promises are in the rejected state, we have to return with an aggregate error, and we have to pass the list of reasons in an array. So for that, we need to access the length and index of the promises object that we get. What I mean by that is it can be any valid iterables, but for the functionality, we have to convert this into an array, and we can use array.from static method, and we can pass promises. So what it does is that it takes this iterable object, and it will convert this iterable object into an array, and we can store it into a variable. Okay. Now we can access the length field, and we can use it just like an array. Now the other issue with this, the from method accepts all the iterables and array-like objects as well that need not be an iterable. What I mean by that is, if you just do array.from and pass an empty object, it gives you an empty array. But here the empty object is not an iterable, which means the empty object is not having the field symbol.iterator. So it is not an iterable, but still array.from returns a empty array. So in that case, we have to explicitly check if the promises object that we are receiving in this function is an iterable or not. So we did the same with promise.all. So we do the same check here. So we can copy it from here. So what it is doing, type of promises of symbol.iterator. If it is not function, which means this promises object should be having a field symbol.iterator and its value should be function, then it is an iterable. If that's not the case, this is not an iterable, and we have to reject this return to promise with a type error, and we can pass the message as object is not iterable. And we are using the return statement here just to stop the execution further. Okay, that's the case. Now, what happens if the iterable is empty, which means if the length of this list is 0, then also we have to reject this promise, but this time with an aggregate error. So what we can do here, if so here, if the input iterable is empty, then we will reject it with the aggregate error, and the errors field will be empty, and the message stays all promises were rejected. Here also we have to add a return statement to stop the further execution. So if these two cases are passed, then what we have to do, we have to iterate the list. So for that, we can use a for loop. Okay. Here again, I'm using this traditional for loop instead of the for each method of the array because of the performance. So we don't know how big it will be, the list of promises, because this is a library function. For each is of course more readable method, but for larger inputs, if you compare the performance of a traditional for loop and for each, this one performs better. Okay, so that's the reason we are using for loop here. So here you can see that we iterate through the list, and for each item we are using the promise.resolve static function, and we are passing the item. So why we are using promise.resolve here is this promises iterable can have promise instances as well as other values. I mean normal objects, primitive values, or anything, which means there can be promise instances and non-promise values. So in that case, what we have to do is that we simply need to convert everything into promise. So that's the only reason we are using the resolve static function here. So when we wrap it with this resolve static function, everything becomes promise, so that we are able to call the then method. And this any function is looking for the first fulfilled value. So here, as the on fulfilled callback, we can simply pass the resolve function. So if any of the item gets into, if any of the promise instance becomes to the fulfilled state, this resolve function will be called. And the first promise instance that uses this resolve function will be the fulfilled value of this returned promise. Okay, because so that we can simply pass the resolve function here. Now, what happens to the reject case? To the reject case, we have to track the rejected reason, and we have to track, or we have to check how many promises are rejected. If all of the promises are rejected, then we have to use the reject function, and we have to reject with an aggregate error and passing all the rejected reasons. So here, so we need an extra variable here. So we can just do const reasons. Okay. So what we can do here, reasons of I reason. So instead of using the push method, we are using the index method to add this just to keep the order. Okay, even though we are looping here, we don't know which one gets into this rejected callback first. So it can be in any order. So we need to maintain the order. That's why we are not using the push method of the array, but we are using the index here. So in the correct order, the reason is pushed. Okay. Now we have to check if all promises were rejected. So for that, we need an extra variable here. We can say remaining or completed, and we can give it 0. Okay, now what we can do here is, if okay, so whenever we get into this callback, we have to increase the completed by 1. Now we can check so if completed is equal to list.length, that means that all the received promise instances were rejected. Now we have to use the reject function of the return promise, and we have to reject with the aggregate error. So we can just copy this, and instead of this, we can simply pass reasons. Okay. Now what happens when we get an error in the catch block? We can simply use the reject function and pass the error object. Okay, so this is the implementation of Promise.any. Now let's test our implementation. So we can just copy this example first. Now we can change this to our promise. Promise. Okay, see. So you can see that after 100 milliseconds, we get the quick. Okay. Now let's change this to reject. And we can change this to reject. I'll try it again. So at this time, after 500 milliseconds, we get the string slow. So out of these 3 promises, the last one is the only one that fulfills. Now change this also to reject. And here we can use the catch method. So all promises were rejected, and we get the rejected reasons in the errors field of the aggregate error. Now let's try the case of empty array or empty iterable. So we are passing an empty array, and so all promises were rejected, and we get the errors field as an empty array. Now let's try the same with another iterable. So we are all, so I'm just giving an empty string here. It's also an iterable. So again, all promises were rejected, and let's try with a non-iterable value. So instead of this empty string, I'm just giving an object. So this is not an iterable. Like I said, array.from returns if you an empty array if you pass an empty object. That's why we added an extra check here. We are checking if this is an iterable or not. So this time, so we get object is not an iterable. So of course it don't have the errors field. That's why we are getting that undefined here. So this is not an aggregate error here. This is a type error this time. So yes. So this is the implementation of Promise.any. So we have completed Promise.raise, Promise.all, Promise.any, and we will be looking at Promise.all settled in the next video. Thank you for watching.